Imagine you are standing there, feeling the air thicken with smoke and heat, while your child screams as a hot iron bites into her skin. You cannot move. The crowd parts like a slow tide. Your hands are tied by the laws of a world that refuses to see you as whole. That scream becomes the signal for a vow, not spoken in the market or in the court, but in the private cavity of a mother's heart. One day, what was done to you will be done to him. The story told in the memory of Sergipe begins like that, with a scream, with a burn, with a promise. It is not in the official books. It survives in the mouths of families, in the quiet telling at kitchen tables and under the shade of mango trees. The place is Fazenda Boa Esperança. The year is 1855. The owner, Coronel Joaquim Batista de Souza, mostly stayed away in town. In his stead ruled a man named Antonio Pereira, the foreman, the instrument of discipline, the one who kept the plantation running by a mixture of threats, routine punishments, and the thin sleep of self-righteousness. On that plantation, there was a woman named Rosa and a girl named Ana, Rosa's daughter, 13 years old. Rosa worked in the kitchen. Her days were measured by pots, by the route between the hearth and the well, by the small humiliations that arrived like clockwork, being called forward to be examined, told to keep quiet, made to acknowledge her place. Antonio carried with him a small tool that everyone on the farm knew by shape if not by name. It was a sineta, a thin iron brand that, when heated in the fire, glowed red-orange like a warning at the center of a night. In the hands of the foreman it was tiny and precise, but it carried the terror of the entire system, a visible, cruel mark to make disobedience visible and shame permanent. Rosa's life before the incident was not a life of open revolt. It was shaped by the kinds of small calculations any person under constant coercion must learn. She learned routes, hours, the cadence of men's drinks. She learned when the capatazes would ride out and when the house guests would leave. She learned how to move like a shadow in a place that watched for shadows. But none of that prepared her for the morning the brand met Anna's flesh. It happened in public, as the memory preserves. Antonio had a habit of demonstrating authority in front of others. He called Anna forward, and with the sineta heated until it sang with brightness, he held the iron to her arm. The sound of the iron, a soft sizzle, not loud but final, was a sound that would live in Rosa's bones thereafter. The girl screamed. People remember the shape of the scream in the telling. It is short, torn, full of something both animal and human. Then the humiliating twist that compounded the cruelty. Antonio pressed Rosa's hand to the flame and made her press it against her own skin, forcing her to show obedience and to share the mark. The act was both punishment and theater. By making Rosa participate, he both degraded her and attempted to reassert the plantation's control over even the mother's grief. The image that follows in the memory is not a detailed tableau of gore. It is a focused image of indignity and pain. Anna's arm, red and raw. Rosa's hands trembling. The smell of iron and burnt skin. The sting of smoke in the mouth. Afterward, in the hush that settles over anything the system does to maintain its calm, Rosa clutched her child, and a vow was made. The narration that came down the generations records her words in a few versions, always the same intention. He marked you. One day I will mark him. Whether she said these words aloud to anyone that night is unclear. What matters is that the promise took root. What happens next is the story of a transformation that is patient rather than explosive. Rosa does not rise immediately and seize a weapon. She does not gather others for an uprising. There was no easy path to that in the reality of Boa Esperança. She watches. For months, she watches Antonio closely, studying the mundane rhythms that keep men themselves safe from surprise. The spot where he leaves his sineta by the fire, the way he keeps his shirt loose when he sleeps, how he drinks, heavily, at times when guests leave, and the house is quieter. She notices who tends to bring him his bottle and who moves around the room when he sleeps. In the telling passed down, the practical details are precise but spare. Rosa finds a small knife, and hides it under coals and between hearthstones. She holds it in secret and practices the steadiness of her hand when there is no audience to witness. This is not a story framed as military genius. It is domestic ingenuity under constraint. She learns to steady her breathing, to time her motions, so that a light touch looks like a routine path of work. The planning is less about weapons and more about timing, about the exploitation of routine, about the way in which the oppressor trusts the regularity of his safe world. The night chosen was a night of drink and company. November 18th, 1855 becomes the date all subsequent tellings circle around. The household had a party. Men came. They drank cachaça and told stories. Some visitors left late, their boots making hollow sounds on the veranda. Antonio drank until his eyes were soft and his speech blurred. He fell asleep by the hearth, a figure that had for so long embodied power rendered small and round by alcohol. There is a rhythm to the accounts here. The party, the careful leaving of the cineta near the fire, for convenience, for show, because the man who wields terror seldom anticipates being surprised by it, and the slow, spreading quiet as the last guests drift away. Rosa moved then as she had for years, in the spaces created for the enslaved, within the same routes she had walked all her life. She took the cineta from its place at the hearth. In the oral account, details are few but dramatic. The iron was still warm, no longer blazing but red at the tip like an ember. She stepped into the house between rooms, through the door that led to Antonio's sleeping space. He snored softly. The sound filled the air and made each step feel louder. What she did is remembered as an action precise and deliberate. She touched the brand to his cheek. The mark was small, the same circle he had made on Anna. But it was also a reversal of power. The wound that followed would complicate Antonio's life in ways the plantation system did not intend. In the morning, Antonio treated it as an accident at first, a burn from a superstition or a carelessly placed ember. But the wound infected. Pride and pain twisted together. Men who had once stood beside him began to avoid his company. Some capatazes asked for transfers. Fear and rumor are fast-moving things in a place where reputations, and the illusion of unassailable authority, are everything. The plantation's machinery, so reliant on rhythm and terror, began to show cracks. Workers fled when they could. The story that had been a private vow insisted itself upon the public life of the farm. Rosa's role in what followed did not become public. The telling insists on her secrecy as part of the tale's dignity. She kept silent. She raised Anna while carrying the knowledge in the private place where memory lives. She nursed wounds that were not hers to bear and kept the life of the household moving, marking time in bread, in the stirring of pots, in the bedtime stories she gave to a child who had been marked by cruelty. In the recollection, Rosa survives into old age. She lived long enough to see abolition come in 1888 and to die in 1890, 2 dates that fall like a slow arc at the end of her life. To those who tell the story, these are important facts. She did not go unremembered. She lived past the law that finally declared slavery illegal in Brazil, and she carried with her the secret and the story. There are several ways the story is passed on. In some versions, Anna grew up and had children of her own. In others, neighbors tell the tale with the same reverence, as if repeating a line of scripture. The emphasis is not on spectacle, but on the turning of shame into a kind of reclaimed dignity. The mark that Antonio bore was small, infected, and then a scar. It did not undo the system that produced him, and it did not erase the injuries done to too many on Boa Esperança. But in the memory of those who tell it, it became a story that disrupted the neat narrative the plantation tried to maintain, that power is absolute, and those under it are endlessly powerless. We must be careful with what we call justice here. The story, as preserved in local memory and oral tradition, offers no tidy moral rubric. It resists being turned into a lesson of revenge to be repeated. In the retellings there is a moral ambiguity that people name without resolving. Some call what Rosa did a form of justice, symbolic, precise, intended to return shame to its sender. Others see the act through a lens of sorrow. The world that made the act possible is the same world that created victims on both sides. What the memory preserves most clearly is the assertion of agency. Rosa's action was not a proclamation from a pulpit. It was a decision taken in the dark, measured and breath-held. It was a way of saying, you could not have the last marking. You would carry what you made. The aftermath also shows how fragile authority can be when its performative edges are nicked. Antonio's decline was not only physical. People began to talk, quietly at first, then with the blunt force of rumor. The mechanics of discipline on the farm began to fail because the man who administered terror was now marked by it. That shift did not unravel slavery on Boa Esperança. The institution continued until the nation changed its laws, but it altered daily relationships and the local balance of fear in ways that mattered to the people who lived there. Workers who had felt singular in their suffering found an added measure of shared story. They found a narrative that made different sense of their place in history. Where official records went silent, family memory kept the account alive. There is also a lesson about secrecy and survival. Rosa's silence was not cowardice, it was strategy. In a world where speaking could mean retribution, where confession might summon worse punishments, silence held space for life. She kept the secret so that she and her daughter might live, so that the story could be told on the terms of those it mattered to most. When she passed the tale to children and grandchildren, she did not demand that they repeat the action. She asked only that they remember. For descendants, the story is a way to hold a past that official archives ignore. It is testament that pain was inflicted, that a woman refused to be wholly defined by it, that human beings can find forms of resistance even within extreme constraint. Imagining this scene, the red glow of a cineta, the hush of a sleeping house, the precise touch of a mother's hand reversing a mark, we find a kind of stubborn logic. The planting of a mark on an oppressor is an act that speaks to the complicated human need for balance, for a visible ledger where wrongs have been done. It does not erase injury. It does not make future life painless. But it reorients shame, if only for a single moment. Families who relay this memory do so with an ache and a defiant warmth. Rosa is remembered not only for the act, but for the long life she lived after, for the way she raised a child who would grow beyond that branded childhood. We must also acknowledge the limits of oral history. This account was never recorded in the official registers of Boa Esperança. It lives off the written page in the way people pass on what matters to them. That does not make it less true in the register that matters for family, community, and memory. Oral tradition is itself a form of historical testimony, especially when the formal archives were created by those invested in a very different story. The narrative's absence from the ledger of plantation records is not absence from the lives that carried it. There is something to learn about the forms resistance takes. It is not always large and visible. Sometimes resistance is patient. It is a small invertive operation carried out in the middle of a night of ordinary rhythms. Resistance can be quiet, surgical, and deeply personal. It can be an attempt to restore dignity rather than to wreak public punishment. That does not sanctify the act. It is still a violent encounter in response to violence. It does, however, complicate our understanding of what survival looked like for those trapped within systems of domination. If this story reaches you in any way, if it stirs a memory or a question, hold it with care. Reflect on the ways memory itself resists erasure. The story of Rosa and Anna reminds us that people under the harshest conditions found ways to assert their personhood, in plans, in silence, in acts too small for the official histories to notice. It invites us to listen to what is transmitted at kitchen tables and under mango trees, to take seriously the testimonies that never entered formal books. In the quiet of that farm, in a life that stretched from marked childhood to the day Rosa saw abolition and then lived 2 years beyond it, the story was kept alive. She died in 1890, having witnessed the law change in 1888. She carried the memory into the family stories that would teach the next generations the contours of shame, and the measures of dignity. That is the legacy people remember. Not a simple moral, not a blueprint, but a human act born of a mother's grief and made into private justice. If this tale moved you, leave one word in the comments, mark or justice, to hold the memory with us and share it with someone who should hear it. Stories like this survive because we pass them on. They shape how we think about resistance, about dignity, and about the ways ordinary people find small, stubborn means to say no to humiliation.